Before I go any further, I want to thank my very, very good friend, Laurie Baskin from Theater Communications Group. Laurie has been at Theater Communications Group, I think it's 17 years, Laurie?
23.
23 years. I still beat you, but 23 years. I didn't realize that. That's remarkable.
Yeah.
Laurie has handled the government affairs portfolio for Theater Communications Group for many years, and she is an expert in advocacy, in working with boards, and in thinking about the legislative issues that really shape the environment in which we operate. Many of you who are on today's call are new to me. I'm Marc Scorca, president of Opera America, and our media consultant has told us to be authentic. So here you are in my den, and Laurie, I know you're at home. I have my beard that I said I will not shave until I'm back in the Opera America office. So my thought was that I would have a very stylish short beard, but now I just imagine it getting fuller and fuller as we work remotely for a long time. We wanted today to give you an overview of how advocacy works at Opera America in partnership with Theater Communications Group and others, and also give you a sense of what some of the most important pressing issues are today as they impact the coronavirus, our opera companies, and some of the legislation that has occurred and some of the legislation that actually is being designed as we speak. In terms of just a little bit of background, Opera America is a founding member of the Performing Arts Alliance, and we are a 501c3. The Performing Arts Alliance is a 501c4, which means it's able to do the kind of Hill work, advocacy, lobbying that we as 501c3 organizations cannot do. We're a founding member along with several of the other key national arts service organizations, the League of American Orchestras, Dance USA, the Association of Performing Arts Presenters, Opera America, and Theater Communications Group. Now, the Performing Arts Alliance has many more member organizations, but we are the founding members. We also are a member of what's called the Cultural Advocacy Group, CAG. In Washington, you have to know that everything has an acronym and a short name. That's just the way it is. And CAG, the Cultural Advocacy Group, is a much larger conglomeration of nonprofit arts organizations that are unified in their advocacy approach on Capitol Hill. And CAG includes the visual arts as well as the performing arts. The Performing Arts Alliance, as you can tell from the name, only functions around the performing arts. All members of Opera America are automatically members of the Performing Arts Alliance. So you benefit from the action alerts, from the advocacy information that we share broadly with the field. A lot of it goes to your companies, but if you're individual members of Opera America, it goes to you too. So we have a number of working groups that tackle specific issues within the advocacy portfolio. There's the Performing Arts Visa Working Group, because, and we'll talk a little bit more about it today, making sure that international artists can travel to the United States to sing on opera stages or to dance on the ballet stages is a major issue. And over the last 30 years that I've been at Opera America, the visa issue has become more and more complicated, and it is right now. There is the Performing Arts Wireless Microphone Working Group, and Laurie is the expert on that. Laurie, why don't you just share in a couple of sentences what the wireless microphone issue is?
Oh, I'm sure you've all read in the papers over the last few years that the FCC auctioned off broadcast spectrum. When they did that, they created a situation where there is less available spectrum for wireless microphones used in the performing arts and in everything else. But we only care so much about advocating for the performing arts. But wireless devices are used on our stages for amplification, backstage for stagehands to communicate, backstage left, stage right, and with the lighting booth and so forth. And also devices that feed the assistive listening devices are also fed from wireless microphones. What has happened with the FCC is that many performing arts organizations, as the spectrum was reallocated, had to purchase a lot of very new, expensive equipment. And at the same time, FCC rules do not allow our institutions to be licensed. We operate under certain kind of rules, but not as a licensed entity. And therefore, we have no protection against interference. So someone in the audience with a device or the cab driver going by could affect the quality of performances, cause stagehands' cues to be dropped, that could cause havoc. And so we've been advocating for quite a long time now with the FCC, and it's ongoing.
So we have a whole working group around that. And again, Laurie is the expert in that. We have an arts education working group to make sure that there's funding for arts education, and there still is dedicated funding for arts education in the education bill. We work in partnership. Independent Sector is the enormous umbrella organization for the entire nonprofit community. We work with them. There's something called the Charitable Giving Coalition, which works to think about how tax policy can be improved to encourage charitable giving. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a minute. There's the Arts Education Partnership, and Opera America is a member of the steering committee of the Arts Education Partnership. We were, through our Government Affairs Office, going to have a Hill Day in Washington in March. For those of you who are signed up for it, we had our National Trustee Forum. And on Friday, March 20, we were going to march up about 50 opera company trustees to meet with their legislators, whether in Congress or House or the Senate, to talk about the important issues. Of course, when we canceled the National Trustee Forum, we had to cancel Opera America's Hill Day. But once a year, we all work together on Arts Advocacy Day, and it's sponsored by Americans for the Arts, but all of us are co-sponsors and are agents on the Hill. And again, this year it had to be canceled, but it sort of happened in a virtual way. Laurie, what is Arts Advocacy Day?
Oh, it's an opportunity for all of the arts service organizations across all the disciplines to collaborate on, and it takes months of preparation, identifying what are the federal issues that impact our fields, and then what is our position on those issues, and we come to consensus on those issues, and then we craft a dozen or so issue briefs. We prepare a handbook that's delivered to the Hill in normal years, and we advocate together, and they generally bring about 500 people to Washington. There's a training day that culminates in the Nancy Hanks Lecture at the Kennedy Center, and then the following morning there's a congressional breakfast and elected officials speak, and then we all go on Hill visits. I generally bring a number of board members from Theater Communications Group. I had confirmed Hill visits for March 31st. And one by one, those offices started saying, can we get on the phone instead? And so we had our Hill visits, and I've actually got another one tomorrow. And we did it virtually. And it's okay, it works. Not as well as being in the same room and looking them in the eye in the same way, but we made our point and we showed up.
Yeah, and it's great that you're doing it. And in fact, some of that phone calling strategy and some of that letter writing strategy is what we're going to talk about today in terms of what board members can do at any time of year, not just at Arts Advocacy Day, not just at Opera Day on the Hill, but at any time that there's an important issue. The phone calls, the visits in home offices, the letter writing, it's all essential to our being active citizens. And once you participate, and I've done a few of the Arts Advocacy Days, and when you're in the office of your legislator talking about an issue that matters to you, it's a deeply patriotic feeling because you realize that for all of the media coverage, we do live in a participatory democracy. And if you make an appointment to talk to a legislator about something that really matters to you, you can make a difference. And if enough people do it, they can really change the tide. And when you experience it, when you get practiced at it, you realize it's not a chore, but it's actually kind of a civic responsibility that is deeply satisfying. That's been my experience. Laurie, probably the same with you.
23 years I've been at TCG. I've been doing the advocacy work and heading that up since 1999, so over 20 years. and it never gets old. I find it invigorating and exciting to be able to educate elected officials and their staff about our world. We can't expect them to know about our world, and we learned that back in the culture wars. We expected them to know all of our issues, and that's unreasonable. When you go to the Hill and you see all the different groups there wearing their buttons and talking about their issues, there's so much for the Hill staffers and the elected officials to absorb. So it's really quite exciting to be able to go and talk about our sector and what makes us tick, why we're important in our communities and to the nation, and to sort of lift that up.
I want to come back to Laurie's phrase, educating our legislators, in just a second. I just want to remind everyone that if you scroll down, if you just touch to the bottom of the screen where you see my image or Laurie's image, you'll see that there's a Q&A. You can ask questions there. You also can do it through the chat function. I'll be monitoring both the Q&A and the chat. So as you have questions, I'll be able to weave them into our conversation. One of the big things in thinking about your role as advocates is not to think of yourself as a lobbyist promoting a special interest, because I think a lot of government affairs and a lot of lobbying has a kind of bad reputation. The idea of educating your legislators, there's such a spectrum of material they need to know about in order to enact laws that benefit our country. They don't necessarily know about opera or nonprofit theater or dance. They don't know that we're nonprofit. When you go on the Hill, they don't understand the education programs that we do, the number of people we employ, the economic benefit of the restaurants and the parking garages, and for the festival opera companies, the hotels that are used. There is a remarkable amount that, with the best of intentions, our legislators don't know. So it's not about lobbying in a negative sense, but it's very much about educating them in a positive sense about what the entire nonprofit sector means. Laurie, has that been your experience?
Oh, absolutely. And there have been occasions when we've advocated together with other sectors within the nonprofit sector, higher education and social services and health and religious entities around tax issues. So yeah, and sometimes even within the sector, we need to make the case for our value. And it's important for all of us to have those talking points and be facile at it and be able to sort of make the case rather than, I was going to say argue, but no, but make the case for why we're important. Boy, don't we feel it now? We're important. We're also isolated in what we normally do. Bring people together under one roof and in this space together to experience something is so incredibly valuable. So yes, it's an extraordinary thing to go to the Hill and be able to talk about our value to elected officials and their staffs, yes.
It's one of the things that we've been talking about even today in the CAG meeting we just got off of, that in asking for help from government at this point in time, we're not asking for help just for survival, which is kind of self-serving, but when we are allowed to come together again as communities, the arts are going to be one of the primary drivers of a reunification of people in their city. I remember when I was at the opening concert in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, and what it was like for the symphony and the opera to do a joint concert where people came back from the hurricane for the first time. And we're to do the same thing. You know, we don't know what it's going to look like when we reopen, but we know that people will have to get used to being together again, and that one of the reasons they will come together is to enjoy arts experiences. So we need support to make it through organizationally, but we want to make it through organizationally so we can bring our special gifts back to our communities once they are reconvening. So it's an important spin on thinking about why we need the support.
Mm-hmm.
There are a few things that have come down the pike in the past week or so. The big CARES Act, and we heard about it. It passed about 10 days ago. The president signed it, and it provides $2.2 trillion in relief from the current crisis. And there are a number of provisions in it, and we're just going to talk a little bit about it and how those predictions may come to pass. So we'll see. But in the meantime, let me start by talking about the SBA loans. And probably all of your opera companies have applied for the Small Business Administration loans to support payroll in the form of a multi-month loan. And we're hearing all kinds of things about it today. We don't have answers. And that's one of the hard parts for Laurie and me, is that we don't have answers. We can just report to you about some of the chaos out there. But the federal government only gave guidance to the banks Thursday night, and many of the banks on Friday were scrambling to figure out how they would administer these SBA loans. There is a 500 employee cap to the size of the organization that can apply for the SBA loans. And that alone is an issue for us. We have several opera companies, we have some symphonies, museums. Laurie, do you have any nonprofit theaters that are over the 500 cap?
Not that I've heard of, but people don't know which employees to include,
right, to
reflect what's the payroll. Does the payroll include the ushers and the, people want to include actors, for instance, but most of the time actors are not on the payroll. They work as independent contractors, and there's a different piece of the bill we're going to talk about that should serve them. So I don't think theaters, I don't think theaters are hitting that 500, but there's a lot of confusion about exactly what to include, and your formula is based on exactly how many full-time employees or equivalents you have on your payroll. So it's been a confusing few days.
Yeah, and every one of our opera companies is different, because at some of our opera companies, the symphony, or the orchestra and the chorus are treated as employees for the weeks that they work. At some, they're independent contractors. Right. As Laurie says, whether independent contractors are included or not in the employee count is still unclear even today. And then we've heard from several banks, and fair warning to everyone who's listening, we heard that Wells Fargo has issued a press release, actually, that says they are only dealing with organizations with fewer than 50 employees. That cuts out a lot of our opera companies. And then we've heard from two different banks, one in the Southwest and one in the Upper Midwest, where the banks are only going to accept applications or process applications from nonprofits after April 10. So what we're hearing today is that banks are choosing their own operating policy for processing the SBA loans that have been included in the legislation. It's very confusing.
And Mark, there also, we've heard some banks saying things like, we're only going to accept applications from organizations that we have not only a banking relationship with, but a lending relationship with. So banks are coming up with their own rules, and they're trying to, in some way, limit, I think, the pool of applicants, because they expect a flood of applicants, and I think rightly so.
Yep. There was a question in the Q&A about whether there's any floor in terms of the number of employees, and no, there is no floor. There's just the cap. And then there was another question from a little bit earlier of when do we anticipate some reopening of theaters, and do we think it's going to be sudden or gradual? We just have no idea. And one of the challenges right now is that we have to get used to living with uncertainty. And it's the hardest thing. We all want to make plans and scenarios for our theater companies and our opera companies, but right now, uncertainty, unfortunately, is the rule of the day. So we can talk more about the SBA loans, but that's just an update about the fact that it is confusing. If you're hearing from your opera company staff that it's confusing, yes, it is. And Rani, it's 50 is the cap, not 50 is on some of the banks, or their Wells Fargo is saying no more than 50 employees, 50. Then in terms of unemployment insurance, the relief bill provides for another $600 per week on top of whatever the state provides in unemployment insurance. This is good through the end of July. What matters is that a number of our opera companies are looking at furloughs or extended leave, And a lot of the employees who may be furloughed or put on leave are employees who don't make much more than, if they make more than, the state unemployment payment plus the $600. So the unemployment insurance has given us some flexibility. Not that we want to lay staff off, but that if we are forced to do so, at least through July 31st, there is an improved unemployment payment to them that will make the economic dislocation less than it might be. So that's a good thing. In terms of the National Endowment for the Arts and its special infusion of $75 million, I had a lot of questions on Friday about this. Laurie, do you want to talk about that $75 million infusion?
Oh, I don't have the language right in front of me, but it is $75 million sort of special relief appropriation to the National Endowment for the Arts. The agency is working to come up with guidelines, but it is meant to be relief oriented and different from their normal annual appropriation and then grants to the field. We expect that they'll have guidelines, or at least I've been told, they'll have draft guidelines in May, that they will, excuse me, my house line is ringing. You might hear that in the background. The National Council for the Arts, the governing body of the agency, would have to approve the guidelines in June. Actually, the Office of Management and Budget has to approve it before then the National Council, and hopefully monies can be distributed in July. And they're coming up with guidelines and an application process.
It will be a competitive application.
A competitive application process. $75 million is nothing to sneeze at, but it's not what we were hoping for. It will not meet all of the need. We have heard that, we know last time there was a relief package was 2009, and the agency limited applicants to those that had already received NEA funding. And it is likely that they would do that again. I don't know what years. I mean, they might say in the last 5 or 6 years or something like that. It wouldn't have to necessarily be just the last year. We do know that as their annual appropriation is dictated, that 40% of the amount of money would be distributed to state arts councils to give grants at the state level, and the 60% then would be in direct grants from the NEA to cultural institutions.
So that leaves $45 million after the 40% distribution to the state arts agencies, and $45 million on a competitive application basis. Now, we know in opera that the lost box office revenue from cancellations that have been announced so far is over $100 million. I think, Laurie, at TCG, you were coming up with something like $750 million as a number.
We were extrapolating we did a survey of our member theaters. We have about 500 member theaters across the country, and we have almost 200 responses, surveys filled out, and we extrapolated from that to the universe of professional nonprofit theaters. And yeah, we came up with, it was about $750 million. And that was several weeks ago, and people were trying to guess what the impact would be, the economic impact. And I think, we plan to survey them probably monthly, yeah. And I expect it'll only get worse and worse and worse, unfortunately.
One of the things with advocacy is how much fact basis matters. That it really, really matters when we go up on the Hill or when we're communicating with legislators by letter or by phone, that we have facts. That we can say, between symphony, opera, ballet, theater, all of the lost ticket revenue, it could probably be $1 billion. But in talking about the specific numbers, looking at by discipline and the number of productions that have been canceled, performances canceled, it puts into sharper relief, in a way, how minuscule the $75 million infusion is.
Yes.
So, if you hear from your member company staff that it's yet another survey from Opera America or from TCG, we need the data to then turn it back to you to give you talking points to speak to your legislators. After the $75 million, the other point I wanted to raise was about tax policy. So we were able to get some improvements in to create new benefit for contributions to the nonprofit sector in general. The arts can participate, but it's not limited to the arts. One of the things is that if you itemize your taxes, you can deduct your charitable contributions. If you don't itemize your taxes, and most Americans don't itemize their taxes, they can't deduct their charitable contributions. There's something we've been fighting for years, which is called the universal tax deduction, which would mean that even non-itemizers could deduct their charitable gifts. And in the relief bill, that is now allowed to a cap of $300. $300. It is for those people who don't itemize their taxes. It is not a lot of money, the $300. It falls into the category of what I call better than a poke in the eye. And we're trying to get that higher, but at least we have the concept in the door of allowing people to deduct their charitable gifts even if they don't itemize.
And Mark, that's a temporary provision as part of the CARES Act. Right. I don't think it's permanent, no. And it's meant to be in relation to relief from this crisis. We will be doing two things as a community of arts advocates. We'll be advocating to make it permanent and to have the cap raised. Mm-hmm. But for now, it's better than, well, yeah, better than a poke in the eye for sure.
In your experience, Laurie, is a gift to a theater company or an opera company, does that count as relief if they are helping to support the organization through the crisis?
I think so, and I think the way they're determining that is during, it's a universal deduction during certain dates in time.
Okay, great. Then there's also, for large donors, an increase in the amount that can be contributed. Even for major donors, there's a limit to what can be deducted relative to the adjusted gross income. And that cap has been raised so that way major donors who elect to can enjoy the tax benefits of larger contributions. So both for the smaller donor and for the major donor, within a finite time period, there is tax benefit to charitable contributions. Good. So one of the things we also know from all of our calls is that different localities and different states are thinking about different kinds of relief. At the Performing Arts Alliance, at the Cultural Advocacy Group, we only monitor federal legislation. We don't have the resources, the staff capacity to know what's going on in each city or in each state. But lots of cities have cultural agencies, have cultural advocacy groups, state arts advocacy groups. We encourage you to get on their mailing lists. You can Google your state, see if it has a state arts council, see if it has, well, it has an arts council, see if it has a state advocacy group, Californians for the Arts, Bay Area League for the Arts. Sign up so that way you can find out what's going on locally and at the state level. We don't really have any more tracking than that, do we, Laurie?
No, when I want to know what's the advocacy organization in a state, I literally Google Citizens for the Arts in whatever, Georgia or Minnesota, and something will come up and you'll figure out then online what organization takes the lead on those efforts, and you can usually find their website with ease and sign up to receive alerts.
Yeah. So, Laurie, before we get into some of the technicalities of what we're looking to achieve in phase 4 relief stimulus, because there will be a phase 4 to the federal legislation, what are some of the things that trustees of opera companies can do, should do? What is most effective as advocates?
Oh, I think trustees are the best advocates for the arts because of the connections that they have in their communities with so many other important people, elected officials being, one sector. I always tell theater leaders, I think that there's this impulse to want to think, oh, we advocated for the NEA last year or 5 years ago, and we got through that tough time with that Congress or whatever, and we thought we'd be done with it. Well, no, this is an ongoing 365 days a year, every year activity. The Dairy Association and AARP and all the others that you could think of, they never think of their work and their advocacy for their sector, that they don't think of that as being done, and nor should we. Just like we're trying to build audiences or get more press coverage or market to sell more tickets, or whatever are the various sectors and stakeholders that we are traditionally always reaching out to. Elected officials and their staffs, both in the district and at the federal, if we're talking at the federal level, but Washington and at home, it's important to have relationships, because boy, right now, if you already had been talking to those folks, they're positioned, they know you, and they can help guide you. So it's another resource for you as you're trying to understand SBA loans, and my bank is telling me this, and my accountant is telling me something contradictory. You could call your House of Representatives staff person and say, I'm having trouble accessing XYZ. They're a good resource if you're trying to bring artists from abroad as well. Any number of issues. So letting them know all the time what are the issues that impact your opera company, or and perhaps you're on other boards as well, your museum and theater company, all of the cultural institutions in your community that make your community the special place that it is. That's important for us to share with elected officials all the time. So the easiest thing is when you get an action alert from Opera America, that you click the Take Action button, and you will find yourself on a page that already has a draft that says, this is what you should write. It's better and much more effective if you personalize it and say, I'm a trustee of XYZ Opera Company. We employ, 150 people year round, whatever it is. We serve X number of audience members, and we serve so and so many students in the local school system. We have a tremendous economic impact in our community, and we'd like you to do this. And the ask, the thing that we want them to do, is already written for you. And so you personalize it a little bit at the beginning and hit send. Very easy.
And it automatically goes to the representative or the senator. It is pre-populated for you.
You don't even have to know who your elected officials are, but hopefully you do know who they are. And every now and then you might want to be picking up the phone and calling them and inviting them to your opera company or to the education program to see what an impact those programs are having on young people or senior citizens or whatever. It's just important to have those lines of communication and the relationships already in place, because it then well serves your organization all the time.
Now, Laurie, if you invite a congresswoman to see an education program or to come to a performance, you may not get the congresswoman, you may get a staff member. Is that okay?
It is okay. Now, there are rules about gifts. I think that's what Mark was prompting me. I think if they come in their official capacity and you ask them to say a few words or give them something official to do, I think you can give them a free ticket. Otherwise, I think that you can provide them with the least expensive ticket, and then you can always move where their seat is. But I think that there are ways to work within the system to make it legal and proper. There was something that Mark said very early on in this call about how the Performing Arts Alliance is a C4 and they can do things that we are not allowed to do. And I'm going to take issue with that a little bit, Mark, okay, because good. We are allowed to advocate as 501c3 organizations, which Opera America is, and TCG is, and all of your organizations are. We can all advocate. Even with my salary, TCG does not meet the threshold. You're allowed to spend a certain amount, a percentage of your overall operating budget on advocacy. And even with my annual salary figured in, TCG doesn't come close to what that limit is. So it's actually encouraged. Nonprofit organizations have an educational mission as part of what we do. We serve the public good, and we are not only allowed to, but encouraged to participate in this process. And because of the nature of trustees and how you serve your volunteers, it's a little bit less sort of self-interested of you to be the ones speaking on behalf of your organizations. You can speak broadly across sectors and so forth, and maybe you already know some of these elected officials and their staffs, and those relationships can be put to good use in times like these especially, but all the time.
Laurie, a really good question came in. What's the difference between advocacy and lobbying?
Oh gosh, I don't have the definition right in front of me, but lobbying, see if I can put it in just sort of layperson's terms. Lobbying is directly contacting elected officials or their staffs about pending legislation. Advocacy, I think, is a broader activity that just focuses on a particular sector or something. So actually, when TCG sends out an action alert and says, there's going to be a vote on the floor of the House about funding for the National Endowment for the Arts, please contact your elected official to vote yes, or something like that. TCG is doing lobbying, and so are you if you respond. And that's okay.
But as trustees, you're individuals, so you can do it. You're just citizens, so you can say,
even staff of the opera company can do that, because it's this much time out of the whole year and doesn't take up anything in the budget to do that. So it's okay and encouraged. Advocacy is just a more, loosely, I think speaking on behalf of the field of theater or opera in certain settings is just more advocating, which I almost more
it's more the educational role.
Yes.
So that if I invited my congresswoman to see an education program in the elementary school because it's wonderful, that would be advocacy. I'm just showing how wonderful the work is. I'm not asking.
So I think that's relationship building and letting her know about the good work going on in the community, and it's not tied to a particular ask in terms of legislation or appropriation. So right. I think so. Yes.
And that's where it becomes lobbying if it's tied to that specific bill.
Yes.
Now, we've talked about the Opera America or TCG has sent out an action alert. You can press a button. You can send the letter. What about visiting in a home office or other kinds of contact that might be more personal and more meaningful?
Well, I think the more time and effort you as an individual have invested, I think the more it counts. When we go to Washington and have our Hill visits, we really make a difference, especially when I bring constituents with me. They don't want to hear from me so much. They want to hear from folks, who can vote for them in their district. And it has a huge impact. When we send out an action alert and we generate X number of responses, they count them. They actually count how many messages came in on what topic, and they track it. And if they're personalized, they note that as well. And it's a super important activity. And picking up the phone, they also count those. So it's a degree, it's a level of engagement, I would say.
Mm-hmm. Some of our boards actually have advocacy or government affairs committees where a group of board members who enjoy it and who pay attention to it, I'll come back to the pay attention to it piece, where they get together and they're monitoring what is going on with local government, state government, federal government. And if some action is necessary that falls into advocacy or lobbying, that they motivate people, they get people going. Because as Laurie says, they count the number of responses. And if Oshkosh Opera gets one letter out, fine. But if Oshkosh Opera has 25 of those responses through the button on our action alert, all the better. So having an advocacy or a government affairs committee that is paying attention to the federal, state, and local issues really matters. And probably on your boards, you have people who, for their companies, because you have corporate representatives, have a responsibility to pay attention to government affairs for whatever industry it is, banking industry, airlines, you name it, every industry has its government affairs agenda. And some of your board members already are paying attention to government affairs issues for their sectors. So they know how to do it. And it isn't necessarily competitive with their paid job,
No.
that they are also advising us on how to be good advocates for the arts, for the theater company, the opera company. Laurie? Good. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. I think that it's a wonderful thing for an opera company or a theater company to have people on the board on such a committee, or at least one point person who receives these updates and action alerts from Opera America and from the Citizens for the Arts in your state and your locale, if there's a city level advocacy organization, and many of the big cities have that. We have, as I mentioned, 500 member theaters. If I put a charge out there, I would like to see 10 messages from every theater every time I send an action alert. Haven't hit that yet, but imagine if they got 5,000 messages every time. Now I will say, every time I send a message, if there were 5,000 messages to the Hill, boy, would they pay attention to what we're saying. And if opera and dance and presenters and museums and everybody is saying that, it just, exponentially increases the communications with the Hill. And if we don't, other people are doing that. So if our sector is quiet, I've been on Hill visits where the staffer will say, well, I haven't heard from anybody on this. So, the impression they get then is, well, it's not so important then,
Mm-hmm.
So it's absolutely important to respond to those alerts. Other than the last 2 weeks, I would say we don't usually send out that many. We've been sending a lot of messages in the last 2 weeks, and of course, it's necessary right now. But if you responded to one 2 weeks ago, don't be shy. Please respond to each one. TCG has generated about 7,000 messages to the Hill in the last 2.5 weeks, which I'm proud of. I think that we have made a difference. The SBA loans, I think this is the first time they've ever been open to nonprofits. So that was a huge win for our sector. And the unemployment insurance, the fact that self-employed freelancers are eligible, it's another huge win for our sector, because boy, those individual artists are most vulnerable and out on the front lines of this. So it makes a difference what we've been doing.
And it's fascinating what strange bedfellows we will find in advocating. So we talked about the universal tax deduction, where up to $300 for people who don't itemize, they can deduct. The churches want that. So lo and behold, we are very much in the same rowboat with the religious community about that universal charitable deduction. When it comes to hourly workers and tip-based workers, we're in the same boat with the restaurant industry. So, I don't want you to think ill of us, but we will partner with anybody if they are sharing our point of view about a particular issue. And I agree with Laurie, the fact that hourly and contract workers, which are so many of our artists, are able now to access unemployment benefits is a tremendous first. My hope is that we don't back off it, that this crisis has opened a door so that these people are protected down the road. In a way, the same with the universal charitable deduction. Having put it in place, and seeing that philanthropy increases through this medium, then we can keep it. There was just a question that came up about TCG. Theater Communications Group is what TCG stands for. Absolutely lots of activity that you can do at the board level to motivate people to participate, to respond to the action alerts. I was going to say earlier that we are very judicious about what action alerts we send out. We don't want to burden you. We don't want to clog your email box. So we wrestle with what point in time, what issue rises to the level of sending out an action alert. If you have advocacy or government affairs committees who are sort of handling it, we can send out more and we can do better.
And please forward them to all your friends too. The more the better.
So we have some issues that are up now, and we don't have any bills right in front of us right now, but we are, and of course, Laurie, correct me on that if I'm wrong on that. We are beginning to formulate what phase 4 might look like in the stimulus.
That's exactly right.
And there is some thought that if the SBA money is exhausted in this round, that we might get an extension and more SBA money. There is a thought that if the unemployment situation still looks abysmal at the end of July, that they could extend the number of weeks by which this additional money is available. But they're talking about wrapping other things into what the next stimulus bill might be. And there's some talk about infrastructure. So we just had a call today. Yes, there are highways and there are tunnels and all sorts of infrastructural things that are essential in our country. But let's not forget cultural facilities. How many of your theaters, whether you own them or rent them, have deferred maintenance, where if infrastructure were written broadly to include cultural facilities, we might all benefit. And there are probably some other ways too to think about infrastructure in the arts context. But we're beginning to formulate some of these recommendations. We want to try to raise the cap of 500 employees higher, so that way our biggest opera companies and performing arts centers can apply for the SBA loans. Laurie, are there other aspects of this that you want to highlight of what's in formulation?
I don't know that we know yet. They really worked through the weekend, I think, in terms of behind the scenes conversations. I think they're in recess, Congress, now for the holidays. I would turn it around and I would say to your field and your members, what are the unmet needs from the second and third stimulus bills that were meant to provide relief? I think mostly in terms of jobs and, retaining employees, reimbursing organizations for that payroll cost when there's no money coming in. I think that's what advocates are at the stage now where we would very much like to hear what are the unmet needs. I happen to think that you're right, right on the money, Mark, with it's more money for the SBA loans and more unemployment monies for additional weeks. But what else? What's out there? What are those needs?
So we will be, and as you know, we are convening conference calls all day, every day, talking to different parts of the opera industry. I'm sure you're doing it at TCG, Laurie. So we'll be collecting what we hear from our members to try to feed them into the cluster of our government affairs staff who'll be working on the proposal that we finally submit and see how much we can get into the legislation. However, given the fact that we had some big wins last time around, we are emboldened to think we can continue to have some big wins if we think about what will really benefit our community. But if there were a bottom line to this webinar, it is to underscore how valuable your voices are to the advocacy effort. You are leading citizens who volunteer your time, who give generously in support of opera. You are not a paid spokesperson the way I am, the way Laurie is. You are doing this out of love of your community, love of the art form. You're putting your time and your money where your mouth is. You are the best advocates. Mm-hmm. Responding to our action alerts, that's an immediate thing. But using your relationships to educate legislators about all we do in the community, about our economic impact, about how many people we hire in the course of the year, that is just essential, ongoing, long-term beneficial activity. For me, that's kind of the bottom line message we want to convey. Laurie?
I want to mention something that we've gone almost, 3/4 of our meetings so far, and we haven't said this yet, and I think it's really important to mention. All of our work is bipartisan. in arts advocacy, I think people tend to make certain assumptions about who supports the arts in Congress. And I will say we're wrong if we make those assumptions. Advocates purposefully speak to folks on both sides of the aisle and in both chambers, and we bring the same messages to everybody. I will say that we have laid out for you a number of different issues. There's National Endowment for the Arts funding, tax issues, visa issues, and so forth. And I will say that some of those issues might tend to be of greater interest on one side of the aisle or the other. Tax might go one way and NEA funding might go another way, but that's okay. The overall constellation of issues that we cover and we track and we advocate on, something in there appeals to people on both sides of the aisle, and we do have support from both sides of the aisle. So no matter where you all are from, all the trustees on this call, whatever district you're in, your elected officials should know that you care about the arts in your community. And even if they don't vote your way on one particular issue, they might on another issue, and it's always worth having the conversation. And the other thing that I'll say, and we always talk about in theater, and perhaps you do in opera as well, we are storytellers. That's what we do. We tell the story of why we do what we do, why it's important, why it matters, the impact that we have on people and their lives. It's good work. It really well serves communities, and it's important to tell those stories. So that's what advocacy is really all about, telling stories.
Absolutely. And someone just made a comment on the Q&A that one of the stories we don't really tell is how many people and how many different skills we employ. It's not just the four singers in the Quartet of Rigoletto. It's not just the lead actors in a play, but from bartenders to ushers to box office personnel, finance staff, fundraising, marketing staff. There is, and one of the reasons that we're nonprofit organizations is because ticket prices only cover a modest amount of the actual expense, because we are so labor intensive and we don't replace the orchestra with a synthesizer. We have tons of talented, highly trained people working to produce the plays and the operas. And I don't know that we tell that story well enough, that we allow only the stars to somehow represent our field, as opposed to the army of talented, dedicated people who are doing so much backstage behind the scenes.
We've been telling a story in the last week or two. There have been a few press inquiries about how this virus is impacting the theater field. And I wonder if this is true in opera. There are the technical people, the lighting and the carpenters and the, electricians and all that. There's also the costume people and sewing shops. And in a number of theaters across the country, they've been sewing masks.
The same
for
in opera.
Hospitals.
At so many of our opera companies where there are costume shops and where they still have employees who are working and able to work safely, they are sewing masks. In Atlanta, Minnesota Opera, Washington National Opera, Glimmerglass. Yeah, it's an incredible behind the scenes story. And, and those who are on the call, we sometimes wrestle with this in our advocacy work. Does theater and opera matter because of full restaurants? Does it matter because of babysitters and parking garages? Where is the value of art in all of this? We wrestle with that, and it depends on who we're talking to.
Right.
There are some people who recognize that art is the air we breathe, and that being together with people experiencing the emotions of Hamlet or of Aida, that advances our humanity. There are other people who want to know about what's your payroll, what's the economic impact in downtown, all of those questions. And once again, we're flexible. We will tell the story that needs to be told. And some people need to hear the instrumental value of the arts, and some people need to hear about the intrinsic value of art. We'll tell both stories.
Absolutely. And it's about knowing your audience, who you're speaking to, and which argument is going to resonate more with that particular audience.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely. I'm taking a look for questions here. So that is that question. Okay, got that one. Thank you. Are there, we have just a couple of minutes left here. I'm just looking to see if there are any other, we know that opera is a complete art form. Absolutely. And all of our art forms, and someone's just talking about the wonderful natural attributes of opera as this non-amplified sound of the human body. Completely. But every one of the art forms has its intrinsic qualities that make it special and supportable. So one of the things in our coalition work is that we never really talk about opera versus theater. We never talk about theater versus the symphony orchestra. We are in this together, and we make one another's arguments all around. Because Laurie can't go to every office, so she knows what's happening in opera. And our government affairs director can't be in every office, and he knows what happens in dance or in theater. So we all tell the stories for one another.
And there are differences, of course, between the art forms, but I think there are so many more similarities when you get to the heart of what we do, we're storytelling, and there's emotion involved, and there's bringing people together to have a shared experience and to learn about one another and stories beyond your own life story. And there's such value in all of that. And I think to have a pool of people who are adept at telling stories and building relationships, that's key. And everything else we've talked about on this call is the mechanics of getting that done. But we're always here to answer those kinds of questions or help direct you. But knowing that you are interested in this work and supporting it is wonderful and very gratifying for us.
And the mechanics matter. They matter a lot. As Laurie was saying, people count the communications, count the letters, they count the phone calls, they pay attention and log the visits at the home offices or on the Hill. So this call, we're all believers. We're here because we're believers. It is about the mechanics, and it's about the difference that you can make within the circle of your family, your friends, your opera company, your arts community in your city. We can all make the difference, improve the mechanics, and get our voices heard. So we're at the end of the hour. I always end by sharing my email. I'm Marc, M-A-R-C, that's with a C, at operaamerica.org. If you have questions, comments, suggestions, don't hesitate to email me at marc@operaamerica.org. You'll continue to see from us our action alerts. Know that it's a whole team effort, and that one of our greatest allies is Laurie Baskin. Laurie, if we could applaud so you could hear it, we would. But I just want to thank you so much. You're the best colleague anyone could have, and I look forward to working with you tomorrow and the next day and beyond.
Thank you, Marc. Same back at you.
Thanks. Take care, everyone.